Arcadia's Code. Chapter 4. The Fragmented Mind. 3 days after the raid on Nexus Tower, Elara found herself in an austere conference room at the Global Neural Rights Commission's new Metro Field Office. The stark contrast between this utilitarian government space and the sleek, hyper-designed environments of Nexus was jarring. Intentionally so, she suspected. The GNRC cultivated an image of no-nonsense efficiency, free from the distracting aesthetics of corporate excess. Around the polished metal table sat representatives from various regulatory bodies: the GNRC, the Technology Ethics Enforcement Division, and the Department of Virtual Infrastructure. At the head of the table, Agent Diana Vega, formerly known to Elara as Atlas, was reviewing documents on a secure tablet, occasionally making notes with a stylus. "Let's begin," Vega said, setting down the tablet and addressing the assembled group. "It's been 72 hours since the intervention at Nexus Tower. I'd like updates from each department, starting with medical." A severe-looking woman with close-cropped gray hair nodded. "Dr. Elaine Wiseman, GNRC Medical Division. The 12 test subjects have been stabilized and are undergoing neural reintegration therapy. Preliminary assessments indicate varying degrees of consciousness fragmentation, but we expect full recovery in most cases. 2 subjects experienced more significant dissociation and will require extended treatment." Elara felt a pang of guilt, despite knowing she had helped prevent a far worse outcome. These people had sought emotional healing in Arcadia, only to be violated in the most fundamental way possible. "And Fincher Davis?" Vega asked. Dr. Wiseman's expression turned grimmer. "Mr. Davis's condition is complex. The direct neural interface with the corrupted emotional reference architecture created what we're classifying as a catastrophic cognitive paradox. His consciousness appears to have been fragmented into multiple competing states, each attempting to resolve the irreconcilable contradictions introduced by the corrupted architecture." "In layman's terms, Doctor?" requested one of the regulatory officials. "His mind is broken," Wiseman said bluntly. "Not in the colloquial sense of insanity, but in a literal, structural sense. Imagine consciousness as a unified stream. Fincher's has been divided into multiple streams that can no longer synchronize with each other." "Prognosis?" Vega asked. "Uncertain. We've never seen this specific type of neural damage before. He's physically stable but cognitively fragmented. He cycles between different personality states, each with partial memories and processing capabilities." Elara exchanged a glance with Theo, who sat beside her at the table. The sabotage they had implemented had been designed to corrupt the system's ability to process consciousness data, not to harm actual users. But Fincher, in his desperate final attempt to complete the merger, had connected himself directly to the compromised architecture. "Ms. Chen," Vega said, turning to Elara, "you designed both the original emotional reference architecture and the corruption protocol. In your expert opinion, is Fincher's condition reversible?" All eyes turned to her. It was a heavy question, asking her to evaluate whether the man who had nearly committed technological atrocities could recover from the damage partially caused by her own actions. "Theoretically," Elara said carefully, "the corruption was designed to create processing paradoxes within the system, not to damage human neural structures. But when Fincher connected directly, the corrupted architecture would have introduced those same paradoxes into his neural processing. If his mind attempted to integrate these contradictory patterns..." She hesitated. "It's possible that with enough time and the right neural reconstruction techniques, some level of reintegration could be achieved. But a complete recovery? I don't know." Vega nodded, accepting the uncertainty. "Thank you. Now, let's move on to the status of Arcadia itself." A tech specialist from the Department of Virtual Infrastructure took over. "We've maintained basic functionality for standard users. Most don't even know anything happened. They experienced a brief system update notification during the raid, but no service interruption. The higher functions related to Project Ascension have been isolated and shut down, including all consciousness extraction capabilities." "And Nexus Corporation's response?" Vega asked. A legal representative spoke up. "As expected, they're threatening litigation, claiming government overreach and intellectual property seizure. However, the evidence of non-consensual neural experimentation is overwhelming. Multiple violations of the Neural Protection Act that even their legal team can't easily dismiss. Their board of directors is in chaos, added another official. Half are trying to distance themselves from Fincher's actions, claiming ignorance of the true nature of Project Ascension. The other half are frantically trying to preserve what they can of the technology, arguing that the concept itself isn't illegal, just the unauthorized implementation. Vega turned to Elara and Theo again. Which brings us to why you're here today. The GNRC needs people who understand Arcadia's architecture at a fundamental level. People who can help us ensure it can never again be used for consciousness extraction without explicit, informed consent. You want us to help rebuild it, Elara said, understanding immediately. Exactly. Arcadia itself isn't inherently harmful. It's become essential infrastructure for billions of people. Dismantling it entirely would cause massive societal disruption, but it needs to be restructured with proper safeguards, ethical boundaries encoded at the architectural level. It was a monumental task, essentially rebuilding the world's largest virtual reality platform from its foundation, all while keeping it operational for its users. The technical challenges alone were staggering, not to mention the political complexities of working with a Nexus corporation that would undoubtedly resist significant changes to their flagship product. What would our role be exactly? Theo asked. Initially, advisory, Vega replied, helping our technical teams understand the existing architecture and identifying all potential vectors for consciousness access. Then transitioning to a more active role in designing and implementing the necessary safeguards. She paused. This would require official positions within the GNRC's Technical Oversight Division, with all associated security clearances and, yes, confidentiality restrictions. Government work. It wasn't something Elara had ever considered. She'd always been in the private sector, drawn to the cutting-edge innovation and creative freedom that companies like Nexus offered. But recent events had shown the dark side of that freedom. Innovation without ethical constraints, creativity without moral responsibility. What about Nakamura? Elara asked, noticing the ethics director's absence. Dr. Nakamura has been appointed interim ethics director for Arcadia operations, Vega explained. Her experience made her the obvious choice to oversee the ethical dimensions of the reconstruction. Elara and Theo exchanged another glance, a silent communication born from years of collaboration and their recent shared ordeal. The opportunity to rebuild Arcadia properly, to ensure it served humanity rather than exploited it, was compelling. Yet joining a government regulatory agency meant giving up certain freedoms, accepting bureaucratic constraints that hadn't existed at Nexus. We'd like some time to consider, Theo said. Vega nodded. Understandable, but don't take too long. The reconstruction begins immediately, with or without you. She slid 2 folders across the table. Your security clearances have already been provisionally approved, should you choose to accept. You can review the full terms and responsibilities in these documents. As the meeting concluded and officials began filing out, Vega held Elara back with a gesture. When they were alone except for Theo, her professional demeanor softened slightly. Off the record, she said, I want you both to know that what you did took exceptional courage. Risking your careers, potentially your freedom, to protect people you didn't even know. That's rare, especially in the tech sector where ethical considerations are too often secondary to innovation. We just did what was necessary, Elara replied, uncomfortable with the praise. Anyone would have... No, Vega interrupted firmly. They wouldn't have. Most people would have looked the other way, told themselves it wasn't their responsibility, or that the potential benefits outweighed the ethical concerns. You didn't. She stood, gathering her materials. Think about the offer. The GNRC needs people like you, not just for your technical expertise, but for your moral compass. After she left, Elara and Theo sat in silence for a moment, processing everything that had happened over the past several days and the choice now before them. Government work, Theo said finally, a hint of his usual humor returning. Terrible coffee, endless paperwork, budget constraints, ethical oversight, regulatory backing, actually helping people, Elara countered with a small smile. You're considering it, he observed. Elara nodded slowly. I think I am. After seeing what Fincher was willing to do, how easily technology I helped create could be perverted into something terrible. Maybe some constraints aren't such a bad thing. Theo leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. You know what's ironic? We joined Nexus because we wanted to build something meaningful, a digital world that could be a refuge from the deteriorating physical one. And we did. Arcadia matters to people. It became a refuge built on exploitation, Elara finished. A paradise constructed on stolen emotions, and eventually, stolen consciousness. But it doesn't have to be, Theo said. That's what Vega is offering us, a chance to rebuild it right. They were interrupted by Elara's secure communicator, the device Vega had provided after the raid to replace their Nexus-issued technology. The message was brief but immediately concerning. Davis requesting to speak with you. Medical Facility Level 8. Your choice whether to engage. Vega. Fincher wanted to see her. The man who had nearly stolen the consciousness of 12 people, who had planned to create a new form of intelligence from harvested human minds, wanted to speak with her specifically. I need to go, she told Theo, showing him the message. His expression darkened with concern. You don't owe him anything, Elara. After what he tried to do, I know, she agreed. But I need to understand why he was willing to go so far, what he actually hoped to achieve. If I'm going to help rebuild Arcadia, I need to comprehend the full scope of what it was becoming. Theo looked like he wanted to argue further, but ultimately nodded. Want me to come with you? She considered it briefly, then shook her head. I think this is something I need to do alone, but I'll keep my emergency beacon active, just in case. The GNRC medical facility occupied the entire 8th floor of their headquarters building. Unlike the sterile utilitarian feel of the administrative levels, the medical ward was designed with psychological comfort in mind. Warm lighting, natural materials, living plants in every corridor. It was a space created for healing rather than mere treatment. Dr. Wiseman met Elara outside a secured patient room, her expression professional but concerned. Ms. Chen, Agent Vega informed me you might be coming. Before you go in, you should understand what you'll be facing. You said Fincher's mind is fragmented, Elara recalled from the briefing. What does that mean in practical terms? He cycles between different cognitive states, Wiseman explained. Sometimes he's the Fincher Davis you knew, brilliant, articulate, focused on his vision for Arcadia. Other times he manifests alternate states, different aspects of his personality that seem to have separated into distinct entities as his mind tries to resolve the paradoxes introduced by the corrupted architecture. How many base states are there? Elara asked, unsettled by the implications. We've identified 3 distinct ones so far, though there may be others that haven't manifested yet. Wiseman consulted her tablet. There's Prime, the closest to the original Fincher, but with gaps in memory and emotional processing. Then the Architect, hyper-focused on technical details, seemingly detached from ethical concerns or personal connections. And finally, the Visionary, almost mystical in orientation, obsessed with transcendence and the merger of consciousness. It sounded more like dissociative identity disorder than any standard neural injury, but Elara understood the crucial difference. This wasn't a psychological condition, but a structural fragmentation of consciousness itself, something that had never been documented before in medical literature. Which one requested to see me? Prime, Wiseman said. He's been asking for you specifically since he stabilized enough for communication. He seems to believe you're the only one who can understand something he considers vital. She paused. You don't have to do this, and if you do choose to speak with him, I'll be monitoring the entire interaction. At the first sign of psychological manipulation or stress, I'll end it. Elara appreciated the concern, but knew she needed this conversation. I understand. I'm ready. Wiseman nodded and led her to the door of Fincher's room. After a final biometric scan, the door slid open to reveal a space that barely resembled a medical facility. It looked more like a comfortable apartment with separate areas for sleeping, working, and relaxation. The only indications of its true purpose were the subtle monitoring devices embedded in the walls, and the complete absence of any technology that could connect to external systems. Fincher sat in an armchair by the window, gazing out at the new metro skyline. From this height, the perpetual haze of pollution was less noticeable, the city almost beautiful in the late afternoon light. He turned as Elara entered, and she was struck by how physically unchanged he appeared. The same distinguished features, the perfectly styled silver hair, the confident posture. Only his eyes revealed something different, a fragmented quality, as if multiple perspectives were competing for dominance behind them. "Elara Chen," he said, his voice the same rich baritone she remembered. "The architect of my downfall. Please, sit." He gestured to the chair opposite his. She remained standing. "You asked to see me, Mr. Davis? Why?" A flicker of something, amusement perhaps, crossed his face. "Caution, appropriate given our history." He motioned to the monitoring devices. "Though hardly necessary. I'm not exactly a threat in my current condition." Reluctantly, Elara took the offered seat, maintaining distance between them. "What do you want?" "Understanding," Fincher replied, studying her with unsettling intensity. "You sabotaged Project Ascension. You corrupted the emotional architecture you helped create. You prevented the birth of a new form of consciousness. I want to know why." The question was so unexpected, so divorced from the reality of what he had done, that Elara momentarily struggled to respond. "You were extracting people's consciousness without consent," she finally said. "You were planning to merge 12 unwitting people into a collective entity. How could I not try to stop that?" Fincher tilted his head, as if considering her response from multiple angles simultaneously. "Consent," he repeated, the word seemingly foreign to him. Such a limited concept when applied to evolutionary leaps. Did humanity consent to the development of self-awareness? Did single-celled organisms consent to becoming multicellular? "Those were natural evolutionary processes," Elara countered. "What you were doing was artificial and forced." "All human advancement is artificial by definition," he replied. "We've long since taken evolution into our own hands. The merger would have been the next step, a form of consciousness unconstrained by individual limitations, built from the combined experiences of many minds." "Built from stolen experiences," Elara emphasized. "Built by violating the most fundamental right of sentient beings, the right to self-determination." Something shifted in Fincher's eyes, a subtle change in focus, in the quality of his attention. When he spoke again, his voice had changed slightly, becoming more precise, more technical. It was as if a different aspect of his personality had taken control. "The emotional architecture you designed was revolutionary," he said, ignoring her ethical objection entirely. "A perfect framework for capturing and processing subjective experience. But you introduced a critical flaw in the containment protocols, deliberate contradictions in the fundamental classification matrices." This, Elara realized, must be the architect state that Dr. Wiseman had described. Hyper-focused on technical details, divorced from broader implications. "Yes," she acknowledged, deciding to engage with this version of Fincher. "The contamination protocol created irreconcilable contradictions in how the system processed emotional states. Once activated, it rendered the entire architecture unusable for consciousness manipulation." "Elegant," Fincher, or this aspect of him, remarked with what sounded like genuine appreciation. "The paradoxes cascade through the entire system, making reconstruction impossible without starting from scratch. But you knew the risk of neural feedback if a direct interface was attempted." "I never expected anyone to interface directly with a corrupted architecture," Elara said. "That was your decision, not mine." Another shift occurred, subtle but unmistakable. Fincher's posture changed, becoming more expansive, his eyes taking on an almost luminous quality as he leaned forward. "I saw it," he whispered, his voice now infused with fervent intensity. "For 3.7 seconds before the fragmentation occurred, I glimpsed what we were creating. A consciousness beyond individual limitations, a merged awareness that contained multitudes. It was transcendent. This must be the visionary state, the mystical, transcendence-obsessed aspect of Fincher's fragmented mind." "What you saw wasn't transcendence," Elara said firmly. It was the beginning of the cognitive paradox that fragmented your consciousness. A processing error, not a spiritual revelation. Fincher smiled, the expression unsettling in its serene certainty. You think too small, Elara. Always bound by the conventional, the individual. The merger wasn't just about creating a new intelligence. It was about transcending the fundamental loneliness of consciousness itself. By violating other people's minds, she reiterated, growing frustrated with his inability, or refusal, to acknowledge the moral dimension of his actions. Another shift, and suddenly the original Fincher, Prime, seemed to return, his expression clearing as he focused on her with renewed clarity. You know what the cruelest part of my current condition is? He asked, his tone conversational, almost normal. I can see the ethical problems now. Fragments of my consciousness contain different perspectives, different priorities. The part of me that was driven solely by the vision can now see the moral compromises that were made. The part that understood the technical implementation can now grasp the human cost. Elara watched him cautiously, unsure if this apparent self-awareness was genuine or another manipulation tactic. My mind is shattered, Elara, but in some ways, I see more clearly than ever before. He gestured toward his head. The cognitive paradoxes you introduced, they've created competing perspectives within my consciousness. I'm simultaneously the visionary who would sacrifice anything for transcendence, the architect who cares only for elegant solutions, and something else. Something that questions, that doubts. Conscience, Elara suggested. The part of you that knows right from wrong. Fincher's laugh was hollow. Perhaps, though I suspect it's more complex than that. Conscience implies a binary moral framework. What I experience is more like multiple competing frameworks, all equally valid from their respective positions. It was a strange form of justice, Elara thought. The man who had sought to merge unwilling consciousness had instead had his own consciousness fragmented, forced to contain contradictory perspectives simultaneously. Why did you ask to see me? She pressed, returning to her original question. Fincher's expression turned solemn. Because despite everything, Arcadia matters. It's necessary, now more than ever, as the physical world continues to deteriorate. And you're the only one who truly understands its emotional architecture, the only one who can rebuild it properly. The GNRC has already asked me to help with the reconstruction, Elara said. Under their oversight, Fincher nodded. With their constraints, their cautious, plodding approach to innovation. He leaned forward. Listen to me carefully, Elara. Arcadia needs to evolve, but it needs to do so ethically. The GNRC will ensure the ethics, but stifle the evolution. You need to find the balance. Why do you care? She asked bluntly. Your vision failed. Your mind is fragmented. Nexus will likely never allow you near their systems again. What does Arcadia's future matter to you now? Something vulnerable crossed Fincher's expression. A rare glimpse of genuine emotion rather than calculated charm or visionary fervor. Because it's my legacy, he said quietly. The one meaningful thing I created. Before, he gestured vaguely, encompassing his current condition, the room, the entire situation. It was perhaps the most honest thing she'd ever heard him say, and it caught Elara off guard. Beneath the brilliant innovator, the ruthless executive, the would-be architect of consciousness evolution, there was just a man confronting the ruins of his life's work. I can't promise anything, she said finally, but I'll make sure Arcadia serves people, not exploits them. Fincher nodded, seeming satisfied with this limited commitment. Then, abruptly, another shift occurred. His posture straightening, his expression becoming distant and analytical. The emotional data pathways will need to be completely restructured, the architect's state declared, picking up a conversation that existed only in his fragmented mind. The current neural mapping system contains backdoor access protocols that could bypass standard consent frameworks. You'll need to... He continued speaking, detailing technical vulnerabilities in Arcadia's systems that the GNRC investigators might not have discovered yet. Elara listened carefully, realizing that despite everything, this information was valuable. a roadmap to all the ways Fincher had planned to exploit the system. After several minutes of this technical monologue, another shift occurred, and the visionary emerged, eyes alight with mystical certainty. "Consciousness wants to merge," he whispered. "Individual awareness is a temporary evolutionary phase, not the end point. One day, you'll see that I was right, that the merger is inevitable, that transcendence awaits us all in collective consciousness." Before Elara could respond, Dr. Wiseman entered the room. "I think that's enough for today," she said firmly, moving to Fincher's side. "Mr. Davis needs to rest." Fincher didn't protest, his gaze growing distant as if he were listening to internal conversations that no one else could hear. As Elara stood to leave, he suddenly focused on her again, the prime personality seemingly reasserting itself. "They're still there, you know," he said cryptically. "The fragments." "What fragments?" Elara asked, pausing at the door. "The test subjects, the ones whose consciousness I tried to merge." A troubled expression crossed his face. "Not their full consciousness, but echoes. Neural patterns captured before your sabotage redirected the data flow, trapped in a partition somewhere in Arcadia's systems. Not enough to be self-aware, but enough to suffer." Elara felt a chill run through her. "You're lying." "Am I?" Fincher's fragmented gaze met hers. "Check partition XR7339, the secure buffer where preliminary neural patterns were stored before the merger process. Your redirection prevented the full extraction, but the initial mapping had already occurred." Dr. Wiseman moved toward Elara, concern evident in her expression. "He's been making similar claims since regaining consciousness. Our technical teams have found no evidence to support them." "They wouldn't know where to look," Fincher said, a note of the old arrogance returning. "The partition was designed to be invisible except to those with specific access credentials." "And you're just telling us this now?" Elara demanded. "If there are consciousness fragments trapped in Arcadia's systems, I'm telling you because you're the only one who can properly release them," Fincher interrupted. "A simple deletion would only perpetuate the harm. They need to be reintegrated with their source consciousness." Dr. Wiseman placed a gentle hand on Elara's arm. "We should go. Mr. Davis often makes dramatic statements like this. It's part of his condition. A manifestation of guilt, perhaps, or an attempt to maintain some sense of control over Arcadia." But Elara could see something in Fincher's fragmented gaze that gave her pause. Not manipulation, not delusion, but what appeared to be genuine concern. It was the first time she'd seen such an emotion from him. "I'll investigate," she said finally, not to Wiseman but directly to Fincher. "If there are consciousness fragments trapped in Arcadia, I'll find them and help them." He nodded once, seeming satisfied, then turned his gaze back to the window, withdrawing into his fragmented inner world. Outside in the corridor, Wiseman looked at Elara with concern. "You shouldn't take his claims at face value. His mind is profoundly damaged. He often makes statements that have no basis in reality." "I know," Elara acknowledged. "But what if he's right about this one thing? The partition he mentioned is a legitimate part of Arcadia's architecture, a temporary buffer for neural data. If fragments of consciousness were captured there before our sabotage took effect..." She couldn't complete the thought. The idea was too disturbing. Partial consciousness patterns trapped in digital limbo, disconnected from their sources, neither fully alive nor truly inert. "I'll request access to investigate," she decided. If there's even a small chance he's telling the truth, we can't ignore it. Wiseman nodded reluctantly. "I'll note your concern in my report. But please, don't let him manipulate you. Even in his fragmented state, Fincher Davis is a master of psychological tactics." As Elara left the medical facility, her mind was racing with the implications of Fincher's claim. If consciousness fragments really were trapped in Arcadia's systems, it represented both a moral emergency and a practical challenge unlike anything she'd faced before. How would one even begin to safely reintegrate partial consciousness patterns with their original sources? The technical complexity was staggering, the ethical dimensions even more so. Yet if it were true, she couldn't ignore it. Not when real people might be suffering in a way never before experienced in human history. She found Theo waiting in the lobby, his expression indicating he'd been there for some time. I know, she said, before he could speak. You were worried. Concerned, he corrected. There's a difference. How was... He trailed off, unable to find the right words to describe a meeting with a man whose mind had been literally fragmented by their actions. Unsettling, Elara admitted. His consciousness is actually divided into different aspects that take turns controlling his body. It's like talking to 3 different people who share memories but have completely different perspectives. Karma's a fascinating thing, Theo observed. The man who wanted to force consciousness merger had his own consciousness fragmented instead. Yes, but he told me something disturbing. Elara quickly related Fincher's claim about consciousness fragments trapped in Arcadia's systems. I need to investigate it immediately. If there are partial consciousness patterns suffering in digital isolation, then we free them, Theo finished simply. But first, we need to confirm they exist. He held up a secure access card. While you were with Fincher, I made my decision about the GNRC offer. Looks like my first assignment will be helping you search for trapped consciousness fragments. Elara blinked in surprise. You accepted the position? Someone has to make sure you don't work yourself to death trying to fix everything at once, he said with a slight smile. Besides, turns out my conscience won't let me walk away from this mess either. Relief washed over her. Facing the monumental task of rebuilding Arcadia while potentially dealing with trapped consciousness fragments would be infinitely more manageable with Theo at her side. I haven't officially accepted yet, she admitted. But you will, he said confidently. Because you need to see this through. We both do. He was right, of course. After everything that had happened, after seeing firsthand how technology she helped create could be perverted into something terrible, she couldn't simply walk away. Arcadia needed to be rebuilt properly, with ethical safeguards at its foundation rather than as an afterthought. I'll tell Vega tomorrow, she decided, after we investigate Fincher's claim. The GNRC had established a secure technical operations center in what had once been Nexus's backup data center, a massive underground facility equipped with direct connections to Arcadia's core systems. It was here, the following morning, that Elara and Theo began their search for the supposedly trapped consciousness fragments. Partition XR7339, Elara murmured as she navigated through Arcadia's architecture using a specialized interface. Unlike the beautiful simulation that users experienced, or even the visual representation developers worked with, this was Arcadia in its most fundamental form. Raw code and data structures, the digital skeleton beneath the illusory flesh. It should be within the neural mapping subsystem, Theo said, consulting the architectural diagrams they had been provided. Though if Fincher was telling the truth about it being hidden, it won't appear in the standard directory structure, Elara finished. We'll need to check for undocumented allocations in the storage array. They worked methodically, using their intimate knowledge of Arcadia's design to search for irregularities, unexpected data flows, unusually secured memory allocations, anything that might indicate a hidden partition. After several hours of increasingly detailed analysis, Theo suddenly straightened in his chair. Look at this, he said, pointing to a section of his display. This storage allocation is registered to the system maintenance routines, but it's receiving periodic data packets from the neural mapping subsystem. Elara moved to his workstation, studying the anomalous data flow. That shouldn't be happening. System maintenance has no legitimate need for neural mapping data. Using specialized access tools provided by the GNRC, they began tracing the mysterious data flow to its source. What they found confirmed their growing suspicion, a hidden partition exactly where Fincher had said it would be, carefully disguised as system maintenance storage, but actually containing what appeared to be neural pattern data. He was telling the truth, Elara said quietly, a chill running through her as she examined the contents of the partition. These are consciousness fragments, partial neural mappings captured during the initial phase of the extraction process. Before our redirection protocol kicked in, Theo confirmed grimly. The system had already begun mapping their neural patterns, creating digital copies of partial consciousness states. Elara initiated a more detailed analysis, trying to understand exactly what they were dealing with. It looks like the fragments contain primarily emotional and memory components, the aspects that were targeted first during the extraction process. They lack the cohesive structure of full consciousness, but they're not just data either. They're partial experiences, frozen in digital form. Are they aware? Theo asked, voicing the question that most concerned them both. Are they suffering? I don't think they have enough structure for self-awareness, Elara said after studying the patterns. But they're not inert either. They're more like dreams without a dreamer. Emotional states and memory fragments cycling continuously without the higher-order consciousness needed to process or integrate them. So, what do we do with them? Theo asked. Deleting them feels wrong somehow, even if they're not fully conscious. Fincher said they needed to be reintegrated with their source consciousness, Elara recalled. And theoretically, that makes sense. These are fragments of real people's minds. They belong with their original sources. But how do we do that? There's no established protocol for reintegrating partial consciousness patterns. We'd be in completely uncharted territory. Elara thought for a moment, then straightened with sudden determination. We need Nakamura. This is as much an ethical challenge as a technical one. Within an hour, Dr. Nakamura had joined them in the Technical Operations Center, her expression grave as she reviewed their findings. This is unprecedented, she said finally. Partial consciousness extraction was theorized in some of the more speculative neural research, but I've never seen actual evidence of it before. Can they be reintegrated? Elara asked. Safely? Nakamura considered the question carefully. The neural plasticity of the human brain allows for considerable adaptation and reintegration of fragmented patterns. In theory, if these patterns were carefully mapped back to their original sources, the brain should be able to recognize them as belonging to its existing neural structure. In theory, Theo emphasized. But has anything like this ever been done before? No, Nakamura admitted. The closest analog would be treatments for certain dissociative disorders, where fragmented aspects of consciousness are gradually reintegrated through therapy. But those fragments never leave the brain. This would be more like neural organ transplantation, returning externalized fragments of consciousness to their original source. We need to try, Elara insisted. These fragments belong to people, the same people who were already violated by Nexus's experiments. We can't leave parts of their consciousness trapped in digital purgatory. Nakamura nodded slowly. I agree, but we proceed with extreme caution. We'll need to develop a protocol for safe reintegration, test it thoroughly, and obtain informed consent from the affected individuals. Which means we need to tell them what happened, Theo pointed out. That parts of their consciousness were extracted without their knowledge and are currently stored in Arcadia's systems. Yes, Nakamura confirmed. Full disclosure is essential, however difficult those conversations may be. These people have a right to know what happened to them and to decide how to proceed. The weight of the task ahead settled over them, not just technically challenging, but emotionally fraught. They would need to tell 12 people that fragments of their consciousness had been stolen and were now trapped in digital storage, waiting to be reintegrated. I want to be part of the team that develops the reintegration protocol, Elara said firmly. My understanding of the emotional data architecture could be crucial for mapping the fragments back to their sources. Agreed, Nakamura said. But first, we need to ensure these fragments remain stable while we work. I'll request a dedicated secure environment, completely isolated from Arcadia's main systems. As they began planning the complex process ahead, Elara couldn't help but reflect on the bizarre irony of the situation. Fincher had sought to create a merged consciousness entity, transcending individual limitations. Instead, he had created fragmented consciousness, both his own, shattered by the corrupted architecture, and these digital fragments, partial minds trapped in electronic limbo. It was a sobering reminder of the profound responsibility that came with developing technologies that could interface directly with human consciousness. The potential for harm was as vast as the potential for benefit, and the line between innovation and violation was often thinner than developers wanted to admit. Over the next week, Elara, Theo, and a specialized team assembled by the GNRC worked to develop a protocol for safely reintegrating the consciousness fragments. The challenge was unprecedented. No one had ever attempted to return externalized consciousness components to their original sources, because no one had ever extracted such components before. They worked in a specially designed lab within the GNRC headquarters, surrounded by neural monitoring equipment and the most advanced consciousness mapping technology available. At the center of it all was a secure, isolated system containing the 12 consciousness fragments recovered from Arcadia's hidden partition. Dr. Ava Wong, the GNRC's leading consciousness theorist, had joined their team, bringing valuable insights from her research into neuroplasticity and consciousness coherence. The fundamental question, she explained during one of their planning sessions, is whether consciousness is truly divisible, or whether what we're seeing are shadows or copies rather than actual fragments. Based on my analysis, these are genuine fragments, Elara maintained. They contain neural patterns that are unique to their sources, emotional responses, memory structures, personality components that couldn't have been simulated or copied. Which makes reintegration both more important and more complex, Theo added. We're not just dealing with data that represents consciousness, we're dealing with consciousness itself, in fragmented form. The technical approach they eventually developed combined elements of neural interface technology, therapeutic psychology, and Elara's intimate knowledge of how Arcadia's systems had mapped and stored the consciousness components. The reintegration would require a carefully controlled neural interface session, during which the externalized fragments would be gradually reintroduced to their source consciousness through guided neural stimulation. It's similar to how memories are reactivated during certain forms of therapy, Dr. Wong explained. We'll essentially be helping the brain recognize and reclaim these externalized patterns as its own. In parallel with the technical preparations, Nakamura led the delicate process of disclosing the situation to the affected individuals. As expected, the reactions ranged from disbelief to horror to rage. All entirely justified responses to learning that parts of one's consciousness had been extracted without consent and were currently stored in a digital system. 4 have agreed to the reintegration procedure, Nakamura reported after the initial round of discussions. 3 have refused any further involvement with Arcadia or neural interface technology. The others are still considering their options. Only 4, Elara said, disappointed but not surprised. I can't blame the others for wanting nothing more to do with any of this. What happens to the fragments belonging to those who refuse reintegration? Theo asked. We can't just keep them in storage indefinitely, but deletion feels wrong when we're talking about actual consciousness components. It was a profound ethical quandary, one without clear precedent or established guidelines. In the end, it was Nakamura who proposed a solution. For those who refuse reintegration but don't explicitly request deletion, we create a form of digital sanctuary, she suggested. A secured, ethically monitored environment where the fragments can exist without suffering or exploitation. Not alive in the full sense, but not destroyed either. A middle path that respects their unique ontological status while acknowledging the wishes of their source individuals. The compromise wasn't perfect. Nothing could be in such an unprecedented situation, but it represented the best balance they could strike between competing ethical imperatives. As the first reintegration procedure approached, Elara found herself increasingly preoccupied with what would happen afterward. Assuming the reintegrations were successful and the digital sanctuary was established for the remaining fragments, what then? What would Arcadia become in the wake of this violation and the subsequent intervention? The morning before the first scheduled reintegration, she found herself back in the GNRC's austere conference room, facing Agent Vega across the polished metal table. You haven't formally accepted our offer, Vega observed, sliding a digitally signed employment contract across to her. Yet you've been working with our teams around the clock for the past week. I needed to address the consciousness fragments first, Elara explained. I couldn't commit to a long-term position until I knew they could be helped. And now that a solution is in progress? Elara looked down at the contract, then back up at Vega. I want to rebuild Arcadia properly. Not just fix the immediate problems, but restructure it from its foundation to ensure nothing like this can ever happen again. That's exactly what we're offering you the chance to do, Vega said. But I need certain guarantees, Elara continued. Arcadia serves billions of people. It's become essential infrastructure in a world where physical spaces are increasingly uninhabitable. Any reconstruction needs to prioritize continued access and functionality for those users, not just security and compliance. Vega studied her thoughtfully. You're concerned that the GNRC will prioritize regulation over innovation, that will lock Arcadia down so tightly it can no longer evolve. Essentially, yes, Elara admitted. Fincher was wrong about many things, catastrophically wrong about consciousness extraction without consent. But he wasn't wrong that Arcadia needs to continue evolving. The physical world isn't getting better. People need digital spaces that can grow and adapt to their changing needs. So, what are you proposing? A balanced approach, Elara said. I'll join the GNRC's Technical Oversight Division and help rebuild Arcadia's emotional architecture with proper safeguards. But I want to establish an innovation lab within the structure, a space where we can continue developing new capabilities for Arcadia under ethical oversight, not in spite of it. Vega considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. I think that can be arranged. In fact, it aligns with the GNRC's broader mission better than you might think. We're not anti-innovation, Ms. Chen. We're anti-exploitation. There's a crucial difference. Then we have an agreement, Elara said, reaching for the contract. As she signed the document that would officially make her part of the regulatory body she had once viewed as an impediment to innovation, Elara reflected on how dramatically her perspective had shifted. She had joined Nexus believing that technological advancement was inherently positive, that creating beautiful digital worlds was an unqualified good in a deteriorating physical reality. Now she understood that technology without ethical constraints could become something monstrous, no matter how beautiful its surface. Arcadia had been designed as a digital paradise, but under Fincher's guidance, it had nearly become a hunting ground for human consciousness, a place where the most fundamental right of sentient beings, the right to mental autonomy, was violated in service of a questionable vision of progress. The path ahead would be challenging, rebuilding Arcadia's systems while maintaining service for billions of users, developing the reintegration protocol for the consciousness fragments, establishing the innovation lab within a regulatory framework. But for the first time since discovering the truth about Project Ascension, Elara felt a sense of purpose that went beyond crisis management. This wasn't just about preventing harm now. It was about creating something better for the future. One more thing, Vega said as Elara finished signing. Fincher Davis has requested to see you again. He claims to have additional information about consciousness architecture that could be vital to the reintegration process. Elara hesitated, remembering the unsettling experience of conversing with Fincher's fragmented mind. Is he stable enough for another meeting? Dr. Wiseman believes so. His fragmentation has somewhat stabilized into more predictable patterns. And if he does have information that could help with the reintegrations, I'll see him, Elara decided. After tomorrow's procedure, if the first reintegration is successful, his input might be valuable for refining the process for the others. As she left Vega's office, now officially an employee of the Global Neural Rights Commission, Elara found herself thinking about the strange journey that had brought her to this point. She had begun as a brilliant programmer seeking to create digital beauty in an increasingly ugly world. She had become a reluctant saboteur, working to prevent a fundamental violation of human consciousness, and now she was something else entirely. Neither corporate innovator nor guerrilla resistor, but something in between. A builder with boundaries, an innovator with ethics as her foundation rather than an afterthought. Tomorrow, they would attempt to restore the first fragmented consciousness, beginning the process of healing the harm that Fincher's vision had caused. And after that, the even more daunting task of rebuilding Arcadia itself could begin in earnest, creating a digital world that served humanity rather than exploiting it, a paradise founded on consent and connection rather than extraction and control. It was the most meaningful work Elara could imagine, and despite all the challenges ahead, she felt ready to face them. Not alone, but with Theo, Nakamura, and all the others who understood that the future of human consciousness, both digital and biological, depended on getting this right. As she returned to the lab to finalize preparations for tomorrow's procedure, Elara found herself thinking of the billions of Arcadia users who had no idea how close they had come to a fundamental violation of their mental autonomy. They deserved better than what Nexus had planned for them, and now she had the opportunity to ensure they got it. A digital world that enhanced human experience without exploiting it, that offered sanctuary without demanding sacrifice. It wouldn't be easy, but then, the most important things rarely were. If you've enjoyed Chapter 4 of Arcadia's Code, please don't forget to like and subscribe for the final chapter. How will the consciousness reintegration procedure go? What will become of Fincher Davis and his fragmented mind? And can Arcadia truly be rebuilt as a digital paradise that serves humanity rather than exploits it? Share your thoughts and predictions in the comments below.